Good morning, church. So, when considering what to preach about today on this special occasion of my first opportunity to preach here at CCSM, I decided to focus on two of my favorite aspects of the Bible, parables and paradox. And I figured, why not start with my favorite parable, which is that of the seed and the sower. I think this parable is my favorite because I identify with the sower. I love trying new things. Will this work? Who knows until we try, I say. So I come into my ministry with all of you, and in particular with children, youth, and families in that spirit. I have some ideas of seeds that I'm ready to sow, but I'll watch and listen carefully to learn what works here and what doesn't. I want to learn about the soil of this place, the story of CCSM, the neighborhood, and your hopes and dreams. I hope that some of what I bring will fall on soil that is good for it, but I come with full knowledge that some of it, maybe a lot of it, will not. And I ask humbly for your grace as I and we try to figure this all out. As I've said, I love this parable. I love the generosity and open-handedness of the sower, the willingness to experiment. I love that the sower doesn't presume to know the soil completely or what seeds will land where. I like that maybe the sower is a first-timer, maybe filling in for a friend, or maybe just not that great of a gardener, but is willing to give it a try and is lifted up for it, nevertheless. Or maybe in the sower, we see someone who is non-judgmental, not presuming that it is obvious what good soil looks like, not judging based on appearances. I also like the way that this parable can push back against our risk aversion, our desire to act only after planning very carefully, and our striving for maximum yield. I know I need that pushback a lot of the time myself. I also like the structure of the parable. I like how it's more complicated than simply a story of good soil and bad soil, and that it complicates and troubles that binary. In it, the four types of poor soil are each poor for a different reason. And more than being poor soil, it's really kind of soil serving other purposes. For example, some of the seed falls on the path. Paths aren't bad, just not a great place for seeds to grow. And the seeds that fall on that path serve as food for birds. Certainly no waste there. Other seeds fall on rocky ground, where they grow a little bit, but they aren't able to develop the roots needed to withstand the heat of the sun. But still, there's some growth, and maybe if it had been a cloudy day, they could have made it. Maybe it's really not such bad soil, just bad luck, not ideal circumstances. Still, other seeds fall among thorns. Maybe the seeds don't survive, but other valuable life is growing in that place. And then there's that good soil, but it all isn't the same kind of good. Some brings forth grain 30-fold, 60-fold, and other 100-fold. We aren't told why that is, but it makes sense in a way. We know from our own lives that success varies. Now, I must pause here to say that thinking of yourself as a sower isn't the most typical way to interpret this parable. The sower is generally interpreted as Jesus, and I don't want to suggest to you that by identifying with the sower that I have some sort of savior complex. Just to put that out there. Interpretations of this parable have generally focused on the ways that we are soil, receptive or not to the prophets of old like Jesus, and also receptive to more recent prophets and prophets of today. By prophets, I don't mean fortune tellers exactly, but more people who reveal deep truths about the present that may well have implications for what's coming in the future. Thinking of more modern prophets this weekend, I think of the Stonewall rioters who stood up 50 years ago against police violence, led by trans women of color like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. I also think of contemporary prophets, some of we heard of this morning working in San Diego, those taking a firm stand against the inhumane treatment of migrants and asylum seekers, those who are naming the truth of what is happening, offering sanctuary, grieving the all too many lives that have been lost, and proclaiming boldly, not one more death. Prophets, like those migrants and asylum seekers themselves, risking everything to live and to support their loved ones, caring for children, even when they might be only children themselves. I am sure that many of you have been horrified to see the images and stories in the media yet again this week. Stories like that of the father and daughter, Oscar Martinez Ramirez and little Angie Valeria, who drowned on Sunday in the Rio Grande. What do we do in a world, in a country where such things happen? Where do we even begin? It can certainly be hard to be good, receptive soil for the messages that prophets bring. But rather than only blaming ourselves for our shortcomings, I think we have to ask, too, what can turn us into good soil? Not just as individuals, but as much larger communities and systems. As individuals, I think we need to ask, what are the things that we need to tend in ourselves so that we can be open and equipped to receiving and responding? How can we become ready to nurture and bring life to that prophetic seed, not as passive recipients, but ready and willing to do our part to co-create abundant life with these prophets, and with God? To co-create something that is life-giving and nourishing, not just for us and our communities, but something that becomes grain that can be of service and solidarity, that can grow justice to feed the world. So, how can we tend ourselves and be tended by others into good soil? Not to belabor the metaphor, but are we ready to be aerated and watered, even receive compost in the process? Do we need to weed out things like maybe distraction or busyness, privilege, complacency? I know I've been looking at my own life with critical perspective these past days. The situation of migrants and asylum seekers was brought close to home when I was spending time with a group of kids in this very church on Wednesday evening, while their parents attended the Wednesday Spanish service. After debates about the best Pokemon characters, the kids' conversation shifted to immigration raids and what they have heard is going on. A minute later, they were back to video games and Toy Story 4, but clearly this situation is weighing on many of them. Not something I had to worry about on my summer holidays, that's for sure. I do think that parables, while certainly not solving anything, can offer us something. Parables can help us make connections between the injustices of the past and those of today, and also strategies and hopes and visions of the past that we might try today. They can help us to see situations from new perspectives and expose the underlying all too timeless dynamics such as fear, power, exclusion, and dehumanization of the so-called other. I appreciate how complicated parables are and how they can push us to use our imagination, how they resonate differently at different times with different people. Some people say that parables are like riddles or proverbs, which sort of suggests that they can be solved or that they have one clear moral to teach. For me, I like that the Greek word for parable is often translated as comparison, illustration, or analogy, sharing the prefix para with words like parallel. In many ways, this sense of parable is how I understand the entire Bible. We take the stories and characters of the Bible in one hand and our lives and our world in the other, and we see where there seem to be parallels, not as an exercise for its own sake, but for seeing our world, and sometimes the biblical world too, in new ways. In the words of theologian Karl Barth, we should hold the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Barth lived during the Holocaust and was deported from Germany for refusing to follow Hitler. So we can trust that when he speaks of holding that newspaper in one hand, he knew just what horrific stories it could contain. We can also trust that he knew about the suppression of truth and that the media can't be our only source of information either. One of the unique aspects of this parable is the explanation that is offered after the story itself. Of the about 40 parables of Jesus in the Bible, only 2 of them have any sort of explanation. But at first, Jesus' explanation seemed pretty off-putting, to me at least. When the disciples ask Jesus why he speaks in parables, he says it is a special way for his followers to know about God's kingdom, and that it is a way that is inaccessible to others. Even more than that, he says that for those who have understanding, more will be given, and they will have an abundance, but for those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. Really doesn't sound so much like my social justice-y last shall be first Jesus here. Jesus seems to suggest that his disciples are good soil, that their knowledge of him is going to grow like weeds under good conditions in good soil. But one of the most obvious and persistent themes about Jesus' disciples is that they are perplexed and bewildered, and it turns out they don't know Jesus at all. This gets me to my second favorite thing about the Bible, paradox. The Bible often gives us the opposite of what we expect, and ideas that seem contradictory. So in this case, yes, it seems that those who were closest to Jesus, his disciples, should have understood him the best, but we know that so often they didn't. So often it was the person we would least expect, the Samaritan woman, the despised tax collector, the disabled person on the margins of society, the little child. They are the ones who recognizes who Jesus really is and what matters really in the situation. And Jesus, time and again, lifts up these characters to say, if you want to understand me, look to them. I think we see paradox in the parable of the seed and the sower too. We, or at least I, expect Jesus, the sower, to be knowledgeable and prudent, neatly planting seeds in even rows of good soil, not being wasteful, certainly not being careless. Maybe we can imagine Jesus miraculously not even needing to bother with soil at all, growing his plants in some sort of hydroponic wonder garden. Certainly not relying on something as fickle as good growing conditions, certainly not so precarious as to allow the gospel to be prevented by such worldly barriers as thorns and hungry birds. We can perhaps see paradox in Jesus' explanation as to why he tells parables as well. He explains that he speaks in this mysterious way because people are not understanding him. He says that mystery and analogy are the way to clarity and true understanding, which makes me at least wonder what understanding means to Jesus to begin with. And maybe part of that part about those who have being given more and those who have nothing having even that taken away is a paradox as well. Yet on the surface, it seems to be what we expect. It is how our world works. Like with money, how the rich get richer, money can make its own money, and how the poor all too often lose not even just what they have, but through debt frequently lose even what they don't have. Those who leave behind all they have to migrate may come to lose even more than their possessions. But this parable seems to be more about the awareness of God and an understanding of God's vision for what could be. I think if we think about knowledge of God in the spirit of the mustard seed of faith, the legacy of the widow who gave 2 small coins, of the Jesus who said to become like a child, maybe we can understand it to be congruent with the Jesus who lifts up small things. A speck or a seed or a spark or a second of truth being the key to the kingdom, a prophetic word or a prophetic movement as something that can multiply beyond measure. In verse, I think maybe it's falsehood and fear and injustice and lives cut short that might be the things that won't just be left behind in God's kingdom. Perhaps these could be the things that Jesus speaks of that will be taken away completely. Taken away so the fruits of the Spirit, faith, hope, love, and justice can flourish in good soil. So wherever you find yourself today, whatever kind of seed or soil you might be, I pray that you can find the grace and the gift of the God of small things and small seeds of understanding, small acts done with great love. Whether you are soil that is worn out and worn down by this world, whether you are so busy that thorns would choke out any new life that tried to grow, whether you have had good seeds snatched from you by someone or some system, or whether you are not sure if any seeds were even planted in the soil where you are, maybe feeling lonely or forgotten or left out. I think the promise of the parable is that God is there with you, with us, regardless of who you are or how you are. That God is not going to give up planting, not going to give up on bringing that new life to you and through you, regardless of how completely impossible that might seem right now. I think that the promise of paradox is that sometimes great things can come out of the very worst circumstances, and that sometimes what seems on the surface like something great just really isn't, and that God has different ideas of what matters most. I think our God is one who lovingly confounds those of us who like to plan carefully, who like clear and predictable systems, who like certainty. I believe our God is one who says the beginning can be the end, and endings, however difficult, can be the key to new beginning. So I and we begin in this new relationship, and I pray for openness on both our parts. Openness to trying new things, to trying things that might not work, and for openness to reevaluating just what it is that we are trying to do and what success might mean and look like. And I give great thanks for the ways that is already happening, and the ways that you are already so graciously welcoming me into your lives and into this beautiful community. And I commit myself to ministering to and with each of you, to being here in the dirt and the messiness of life, with the children and the youth and the families, but with all of you as a community together. I commit to being, in the ways that I can, a bearer of God's promise of new life, and a receiver of the new life that this ministry and this community might plant within me. I pray that our harvest, whatever that might mean or look like, will be plenty, and that this harvest will nourish not only those of us who are here now, but through it we might be sustenance and signs of hope and new life for the community and the world. All this I ask in the God of paradox, the God of new life and hope, but also the God who is our consolation in the deepest griefs that we may lack even the words to express. The God who is ever old and ever new. The God who is larger than the universe and smaller than a seed. The God who is first and last and ever present in our in-between times and spaces. Amen.